In this video, I will be explaining how I designed the save system, so I will be showing scripts and it might get a little technical and confusing, so bear with me, but here we go. How's it going? So today I'm going to talk about how I made a save load system for our game Appraisal. So initially we weren't actually going to make a save and load system, we had decided that a long time ago, but I came to the decision that I would rather have the system and not need it than not have the system and need it. So I felt like it would be better for the player to have the option to save for if they weren't able to continue playing, because the further a player got into a run, the longer the run would take. Therefore, the longer the run is, the more likely it is that they will have to get up and go do something else, because people have to live lives. So I decided to implement the save system because of that. And so as such, the way it is designed, I still wanted to keep the spirit of not wanting to have a save system anymore. So how I decided to do it is that whenever the player saves, it sends them back to the main menu. So they can only save when they know that they're no longer going to continue playing. And when they load the game, it deletes their save on load. So there's no save scumming that is possible. So if you save and then load, you can't, if you get in a rough spot in a run, you can't quit the game and then go back and load that old save. All the data is already gone. So like I said, what we wanted to do was prevent people from saves coming and continue that spirit of why we initially chose to not have a save, because we felt that runs would be pretty short, but at this moment we don't know how long runs are going to be, so we decided to implement it just in case. And so how is the saving done exactly? So how a lot of the game works is that each class starts with its own different set of different weapons, different money, and all sorts of different stats and bonuses, health, whatnot. And so what I decided to do is that a lot of the narrative of this game is focused around corporate like stuff and having to pay for everything. This is kind of almost a company town that takes place within the game, so you have to pay for everything, and I felt like paying for saving would be kind of weird and not really feel that great. Like if somebody has to get up and stop playing and they have to save, I am punishing them by charging them to save the game, so they therefore will not be able to get as far because they don't have as much money. So how I decided to go about it is using the idea of the company town. I decided to give each class its own amount of tokens. So what these save tokens do is they allow the player to save for free, but each class only has a certain amount of save tokens. For example, one class, let's say, has 3 save tokens, or like that would be the average or something. So once you run out of save tokens, you save 3 times. When you try to save again, then it will charge you money. The idea behind that is that I wanted to create an artificial type of pressure with that. If you think of the save ribbon system in the Resident Evil games, I would always, for the first 3 Resident Evil games, I played those on easy, so I didn't really have any problem with running out of save ribbons. But what those do create is a sense of resource management and decision making that you have to figure out for when to save. So it creates a sort of cognitive load that even if it's not entirely real, like playing on easy in Resident Evil, that cognitive load still kind of exists and puts pressure on the player to have to decide, should I save now, should I save later? And for the most part, the average amount of save tokens a class will have will probably be enough for the amount of times a player would save in a game anyway. So again, it's sort of like a fake pressure that exists within the game that the player just has to think about to create a decision space. And then there would be some fun stuff that we would do with that, like one class would have infinite tokens, another class would have no tokens. And that can say what it will in the narrative once we actually get to creating the classes, but that's just an idea in my head right now. So first, what I need to mention is that a save system is more than a save system. It's also a loading system, and I found that the loading was the hardest part. And one of the reasons I also decided to do this was because I felt like I should learn how to do a saving and loading system, and it would be a great learning experience, and that's what this entire game is anyway, a giant learning experience. So I decided to go ahead and do that and learn, and I am very glad I did, because I ran into the repercussions of us choosing not to create a save loading system earlier in the game, because the way I designed all the systems and their dependencies on one another, being childs of different objects, and implementing references on start and awake and all of that, when it came to saving, that was honestly pretty easy. So the loading system was about 90% of the problems that I had, and that was because the way I had designed all the systems and the way they depended on one another, be it through references or being the child objects of one another. So the way that was all designed was not very conducive to a loading system. So a lot of my time was spent fighting the way I had initially designed everything. And that made the loading very difficult, and which made me very glad that I decided to do this, because in the future, now that I know a bit more about how a saving and loading system works, I will be able to design every single other element in the game with the idea of how would I load these things together, and how everything can work easier together and come together in a save and load situation. So that's going to be great information for games in the future. So now I can tell you about how I actually made it. So I'm going to start with the save system itself. How I decided to do it is I split everything up into all the values that I will be saving, and from what object or script that they came from. So for example, if we look in the header player controller script, all that I wanted to save for that is how much health you had, how much money the player had, and how many save tokens that they had. So if we go to its function, all that I do is get the values, put them into the variables, and then I add the variables to the player preferences, or player prefs. I actually don't know what it stands for, but that is, player prefs is Unity's way of saving variables. So all that I did is get the variables from their source by creating a reference to that source, and then I save those values. So that is very easy. And then when I load the game, that is where it gets a little bit more difficult, because the order of loading matters. Because as you can see, it's just checking, has the player actually saved the game? This key, the health key, which is what setInt does, it creates a key in the save system. If that doesn't exist, it's not going to do anything. But if the key does exist, that means there's something that can be loaded. It will call this function within the player controller script to apply those variables back into the player controller. So for example, when you start the game as it currently is, it sets the player up with their maximum health, whatever amount of money we gave them. So what this does is it overwrites those values. So it gives the player how much health they had when they saved, it gives them how much money they had when they saved, it gives them how many save tokens they had when they saved. And that's how the loading works for pretty much everything. Let's see one of the larger ones. So the performance tracker, there is a system in the game that tracks the player's performance, which is very basic stuff about like how much money they've made, how much money they've spent, how many enemies they destroyed, how much damage they took, and then their accuracy. So what this was another relatively easy one. So if we go to its system, all it is getting the value and applying it to the variable, and then I just save that variable into the player preferences. Since they're all numbers, in player preferences you can only set numbers and strings. So if everything's a number, it works really easy. So I just hit setInt, and that's why saving is so easy. Now for loading, that's where it gets a little bit more difficult, because I have to, again, apply it to the original object. So I have this function in the original object called apply load from save station. So it takes this array that I created of all the variables that were saved and then applies it. Let me go. So then as you can see here, so it takes all these variables, puts them into an array, and then it passes the array to the performance tracker. And then so this function is called, and it just applies all the variables to the one that it should be, which the order that everything is done in matters. And then from there, all the values are applied easily. So those two were very easy. Where it gets difficult is when you're doing entire objects. So the performance tracker and the like player health and stuff, that stuff is really easy. The more difficult ones are, for example, the saving and loading for the weapon system. So if we look at it, it's pretty much only two variables. If we go to its saving and loading function, so how the weapon is currently set up in our game is within the character, they have this object called weapon holder. And that is just so that different scripts can find the weapon. So we find the weapon holder and get its first child, which will be the weapon itself. This one we just call pistol 1, just for like a test name. So what we have to do there is, so rather than using a string for its name, what I decided to do, I have no idea if this system is a good or a bad idea, but it's what popped in my head and it works. So I created this other script called the ID referencer. And so what this ID referencer does is, if I go into the game itself, so this ID referencer is an object that holds a reference to the prefab of every single object that we might possibly load. So for class objects, right now I've only made one class, so Tyler's the only one in there. For the alternate fires, every single the prefab to every single alternate fire is in there. And for right now, as you can see, the prefab for every single weapon that we currently have is in there. And depending on how much stuff we add, these could get pretty long, but it works, so hey. So what it does is, so it gets the name pistol 1, and then so it searches for that name within the array in the ID referencer. So rather than giving each and every single weapon its own unique ID, because these are all only test weapons and we would constantly change things around, and I didn't want to mess up the ID giving of weapons, I decided to have it so that this script controls the IDs. So the weapon gets its ID from its position in the array. So when we load the game, to get which weapon we want, we look for the ID referencer, and then so we get the script that gives us the ID of the weapon that we want. And then within this array, let's say for the pistol, it gives us ID 13. So it goes and grabs the game object for ID 13, which is the pistol. So rather than getting it from somewhere else, it grabs it from the ID referencer and then places it under the weapon holder. So that's where all three of these is where a lot of the difficulty came from when it came to making this save and load system, because of the way, as you can see, this this giant mess of a game controller, all this between here and here is under one object, and that's how I made it, because it seemed like a good idea at the time. So because of this way that everything is structured, there is all sorts of dependencies between all these different objects. So I had to figure out a way to an order in which to load all the objects that we saved in a way that worked well with the way the systems were currently made as in this giant individual object with all these different children that are all different other objects with their own children. So it's an absolute mess of an object, and everything is kind of dependent on other things. But because of the way that I had set everything up, such as, for example, when you get a new weapon, it contacts the character and lets them know that it has a new weapon, so the character changes its weapon rather than a character requiring the weapon. The weapon requires the character, so I would make the character first, I would spawn the character first, and then spawn a weapon to that character, and then the weapon goes and tells the character, like, hey, I'm your weapon now. And that is generally, in a over detailed but whatever way, generally how I set it up. Like you can see, for example, I saved everything in this particular order, and then I again loaded it in that particular order. So every single thing that I did load, I made its own function. So loading the class is its own function, loading the game status is its own function, etc., so that I can more easily organize which thing comes first. And now the final thing is I'll just show it work, I guess. So if we go to the main menu and play the game, if I look at where Unity stores all these variables, here's everything that's in there right now, because I also had to, there were other things I had to save, like the leaderboard table, as well as the player preferences for resolution, refresh rate, and stuff like that. So for example, otherwise, that is all that's in there. And then so if we go and play the game, select our class. I'm going to go through one round real quick just to show that it works. I'll take a little bit of damage the enemy. If we look at our performance tracker, I've made 250 money. I did 20 damage, destroyed one enemy. I have taken one hit. My accuracy is bullets fired to bullets hit, 100%. Oh, now it's like 66%. So I go to the save shop, which is temporary. So I go and click on it. I buy it. I have 3 tokens right now. Takes me back to the main menu. Now, if we go back to where all the values are saved, I have all these different ones that I showed you within the script. And now that all those values are saved, there's also a continue button that pops up. If I press start, all these values are deleted. If I hit continue, I load up into that old game, and then all these values are deleted. So I'll show you that now. Continue. It applies all the same values that I had before, all the same weapon, the same alt fire, the same class. The performance tracker is all the same. But if we go to this and we refresh it, everything is deleted again. And if we go into the save shop, we only have 2 tokens. So that is essentially how the save system works. I mean, as you can see, also no errors, which is fantastic. So it's relatively pretty simple. It just took me a really long time. 1, because I got a job, and 2, because I didn't realize how difficult the loading portion of it would be, and I had to do a lot of fighting against my own systems to set that up. That was probably overly detailed, but I wanted to show how I set everything up. So, there it is. Have a great day.